Okay, well, welcome everyone to another TCS Plus talk. So we're very happy today to have Kira Goldner from Columbia University, who's actually moving to Boston University, here to tell us about an overview of using mechanism design for social good. Now, before we get started, just a few announcements. I do want to encourage everyone to keep their cameras on to give Kira some visual feedback throughout the talk. Please ask any questions. You're free to unmute yourself, or I'll be monitoring the chat in case you want to ask anything. Finally, let me also give the credit to the rest of the organizers, which include Clement Kanon, Rachel Cummings, Anindya Day, Sumega Garg, Gautam Kamath, Ilya Rajenstein, Oded Regev, Salil Shram, Noah Stevens-Davidowitz, Tomas Vidik, and David Weiss. And with that, I think that's all. So Kira, please take it away.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks to all the organizers, a really motley crew. So yeah, I'm going to give an overview on the topic of mechanism design for social good today. It's not just going to be about my work. I'm going to try and talk about how to get into this area, how to formulate your own problems so that hopefully you can find problems that are interesting to you and your favorite TCS tools. So I think that everybody here knows that our world is, ruled by algorithms, whether it's in an online labor market where we have some algorithm that's determining how to match workers and jobs, or in a health insurance market where you have, an employer who's using some algorithm to try and optimize which of the insurance providers they should contract with in order to maximize the health of their employees. Or perhaps you're trying to use some algorithm because you're the government and you're trying to decide how should you distribute some limited number of carbon licenses among manufacturers in order to, trade off the carbon emissions that you have with the good of manufacturing. But the thing about all of these algorithms is that all of these systems interact with strategic individuals who have some stake in the outcome of these algorithms. And so if they can somehow game the system in order to improve their own outcome, then they will do so. And so, in our health insurance system, perhaps Aetna will misrepresent what their plan provides, or perhaps misrepresent their costs in order to secure a better contract or attract more patients. And so what we need to do is, as we design these algorithms, we need to design them to be robust to strategic behavior. And so that's where mechanism design comes in. Mechanism design is just a subset of algorithm design. Like algorithms, we have some input instance, we have some output outcome that we're trying to do, and we're trying to, maximize or minimize some objective. So we're in particular going to focus on allocation algorithms. We're going to focus on who gets what. But the difference here is that we're talking about mechanism design when our input instance is not just some data, but it's reported by strategic agents, okay? We have a bunch of different strategic agents, and they're the ones who are telling us our input. So we have a bunch of different insurance providers, and they're telling us their cost to cover patients. And perhaps we're the government, and we're trying to pick the insurance provider who has the lowest cost. We want to be efficient. We just want to contract with an insurance provider who has the lowest cost, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to output which one. Here, the algorithmic problem is extremely simple. Who has the lowest cost given the input? Well, it's Kaiser Permanente. But the problem here is that the input is strategic. And so in order to deal with these incentives, we need to output not only who gets what, but who pays or gets paid what. So here we'll output Kaiser, but also some payment. We'll pay them $15 for their contract. And the reason we do this is because we're going to use game theory in order to reason about the incentives within this algorithmic framework in order to try and guarantee optimality or approximate optimality. Okay, so let's sort of zoom out. What's going on here? Like any algorithm design problem, we're designing the algorithm functions of the input, okay? Like in all of TCS, we have our trade-offs, some guarantee, and some computational simplicity, okay? The difference is we don't just have input, the agents are choosing the input, but how they do so is predictable. It's not adversarial, it's not set, but it's predictable. We know what they're maximizing. What I've written here is their utility function, okay? They're trying to choose some action. You don't worry about this function too much, but they're trying to choose some action that maximizes their utility. What they get times their value for it minus what they pay. So there's a very predictable way that they're acting. And so what we're gonna add to our trade-offs is now this input, the strategic input, and thus the output that comes from the strategic input. And so what we're doing when we're dealing with this algorithm design problem is we're either going to design the algorithm such that when we design our algorithm, it incentivizes truthful input so that we just get the main instance, the real instance of their costs, and thus the predictable outcome. Or we can let them act however they're gonna act. They're gonna strategize, they're gonna try and game the system, but then we use their predictable way of acting to analyze what outcome will happen, what their input will be, what the outcome will happen, and therefore what this existing algorithm will incentivize. And so what we're doing is we take our algorithm, we take its trade-offs with computational simplicity, and now we add in the trade-off of this behavior of the input and thus the output, okay? Does that make sense? Please ask questions if there are any. So that's the idea of mechanism design.
Maybe Kira, can you say like what exactly do you need to specify in order to describe like a problem that you need to solve?
Yeah, so just like, you know, if you're talking about a linear program, it's the same sort of thing. You have your variables in the linear program, but the input now is coming from, it's being perhaps drawn from distribution or coming, you know, out of nowhere. And then you need to add in these incentive constraints such that they prefer reporting their true outcome based on their true value and getting their outcome over any other outcome. So they could report anything else. They're gonna have some true value. They're gonna have some true action that they wanna take, and they could take anything else. And you wanna make sure they're taking the one they wanna take if you're going for the truthful one. So there are constraints that could make them report their true value. Otherwise, you could just analyze what is their best response and therefore how will they act. So either add constraints to your optimization problem such that they act truthfully, or analyze what will they do and then input that as your input to the instance when you're analyzing the algorithm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I have one quick question. Yes. So I'm from machine learning community, so I'm trying to compare this to, let's say, supervised learning, right? So you can basically also think of like mechanism design as, for example, learning problem. You try to learn mechanism. Can you say a bit about what's the difference from like standard supervised learning problem?
With respect to learning a mechanism?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So the difference is, I mean, it's, you know, sort of just like algorithm design. It's sort of like asking what's the difference between algorithm design and learning an algorithm.
Yeah, yeah. So if I understand correctly here, the input, you have to deal with strategic input as well, right, in this case.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
So it's not just fixed inputs.
That's correct. That's exactly right. But otherwise, it's the same as asking what's the difference between algorithm design and machine learning, in the sense that when you talk about algorithm design, you're talking about, you know, specifically designing for a particular problem, trying to optimize and compare the trade-offs with a guarantee. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think a lot of us are aware that mechanism design has had a large impact on society. The reason that we're able to use social media, email accounts for free, with respect to financials, is that they're entirely funded by ad revenue. Google's ad revenue makes up over 70% of all of Google's revenue, and it does that by ad auctions. The ad auctions do so well because they are reasoned about using mechanism design. Similarly, the spectrum auction that our cell phones and TV channels all depend on is allocated using mechanism design. Both of these are very different situations, but they're both need to satisfy computational constraints, such as being efficient to design. They need to be tractable. They need to be efficient to run. They're both run in real time. Ad auctions are run every second right now. The spectrum auctions are run, every few years, but when they're run for, days at a time in real time. People are buying back spectrum and then reselling spectrum. And of course, they also need to be efficient for the agents to strategize within. You need to understand how are you going to act within this mechanism in order to understand what's going to happen in the outcome, okay? So these are some of our killer apps that the mechanism design community loves to talk about, but there are many more applications that we would love to talk about. For example, how can we use these tools within society to improve various problems in society? So I'm going to talk about a bunch of different problems today. For each problem, there's a process that we should go through. We should learn about the area, what's in the area, basic rights that people don't have, inefficiencies in government policies, global harms. And then what you should do when you're learning about an area is you want to hone in on a specific high-level problem that's suitable for your tools. Once you've done that, the next step in the process is to determine the model, what to keep, what to abstract, so that you wind up with a nice theory problem. And then once you have your theory problem, you want to solve it. So that's sort of the process that each of the things I'm going to talk about today goes through. I'm not going to go through all of these steps for all of them. Some of them will only go through step 1 or step 2, just to try and see what's out there, see the breadth. I'm going to focus on breadth today. And a lot of it is not my work. I'm trying to show examples to give an idea of how to go through this process. That's the main idea, is how to go through this process, not let's focus on the work that exists, okay? I'm not even, trying to say, look at all my work, okay? I'm just trying to say, I think this is a really cool area that people should work on. What I really, really do want to advertise is that I believe, and this is not true for some of the work today, or I don't know for some of the work today, but I believe that this process you should go through with domain experts, okay? When you're learning about an area, whatever the area is, you should form a relationship with an expert from that domain. You should learn from them. You should interrogate them about the domain and try and understand what's the relevant theory problem. When you are coming up with your model and deciding what to keep and what to abstract, so that's a tractable problem, as a theorist, of course, you want to make those decisions, but you shouldn't just make them by yourself as a theorist. In order to make sure that it's still a relevant question that someone wants answered, you should go through that whole process with a domain expert. And at the end, if you want to do the hardest part of all and circle back to try and take those results somewhere, then it's most important to have your relationship with a domain expert. So that's something I really want to advertise, is I really believe that you should do this process with the domain expert, okay? So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm just going to go through a whole bunch of topics: affordable housing, health insurance, carbon emissions, hiring and admissions, and education, and talk about, where can we see mechanism design problems in these areas. And for each problem, I'm going to talk about some of the steps in this process, okay? And health insurance is sort of going to be the only main technical part. The rest of them are just going to be these higher, learn about the area, hone in on a problem parts, okay? So let's start with affordable housing. So the main issue that we're facing is that, as a lot of us have seen, the rent is skyrocketing in cities, definitely all over the US, even all over the world. And something that happens as the rent is skyrocketing, people are spending more and more of a fraction of their income on rent. Families that are considered low income are often spending more than 50% of their income on rent, and a quarter of low income families are spending more than 70% of their income on rent. And so what we often see is that we wind up having evictions, and evictions have been tied to all sorts of negative incomes. They've been tied to negative incomes in terms of harder to get jobs, harder to get a good education, negative effects in the next generation. And so they're very closely tied to the poverty cycle and getting stuck in the poverty cycle. And so there's all sorts of foundings in terms of this. In addition, another way to deal with this is to try and come up with affordable housing and different types of interventions and assistance. And so how can we incentivize people to try and build these developments? What types of developments do we want? Do we want to just give people vouchers? There's these things called Section 8 vouchers that we can give families so that they can just use these for part of their rent to go live in normal units? Or do we want to build specific dedicated affordable housing units inside other apartments? Do we want to build whole entire public housing structures? In some cities, there's wait lists where people just wait to either get a voucher or to get a specific unit. How should the system work? What is best? What is our objective here? This is sort of the problem that we're dealing with, okay? So one thing that we could do here is that since evictions have been tied so much to all these negative outcomes, is that we could try and say, what if we want to prevent evictions? So one model that we actually came up with in one of the first mechanism design for social good meetings ever in 2016 is, what if you have families and these families have income, they have some base level wealth, and their wealth changes at each time step, okay? They have some income, they get a, shock to their wealth every step, whether it's, income or just some small shock that comes from distribution. What should you do if you want to try and prevent evictions, okay? And so this was something that was discussed a long time ago and then followed up by Radiata Bebe, John Kleinberg, and Matt Weinberg in a AAAI paper in 2020. And so I'm not really going to go into the details of the model, but they explore a whole different number of objectives and interventions. And basically what they look at is if you could give income subsidies or even just initial wealth subsidies. So income subsidies meaning subsidies at each time step, wealth subsidies just meaning a one-time amount of money, then how can you minimize evictions, either the number of evictions or the worst case type of eviction, the worst case outcome to a family, and you're subject to some sort of low income housing budget. And so this turns out to be just an algorithms problem. There's water filling algorithms such as that. And so here we don't actually have a mechanism design problem. And the reason for that is we're not dealing with strategic agents here. Okay, so this is, one type of work dealing with preventing evictions and affordable housing. The idea is we're learning about how evictions are a negative outcome. You come up with an objective, you formulate your model, okay? How could you take this to a mechanism design problem? You could say, what if you're giving different types of interventions, housing or vouchers? What happens if your families are looking at the choice of where they could move to, how that affects them in the future? There's a study called the Move to Opportunity study about if families move into a better neighborhood, then that gives them better effects in the long term. And so you could take this model and extend it forward to look at a whole different mechanism design problem. Here's another problem dealing with allocating affordable housing. This is a paper by Nick Arnasti and Peng Xi in both EC17 and then in Management Science, which is a journal in 2020. The idea here is that you have a bunch of different people who have different needs in their affordable housing. Some people want single family homes, some people want apartments. And so here we really have more than just assigning units, we also have a matching problem. And so you can have kind of two different goals here. Do you want to match well, or do you want to target need? And by need, I mean, they don't have as good of outside options. They can't do as well in terms of finding an option outside of the affordable housing system, okay? And so these are two different objectives. Which one do you want to do well at? So there's all sorts of mechanisms that we see for allocating affordable housing. One of them is called independent lotteries. So say we have 3 different units, we could just have a lottery for each different unit, okay? And so if you want the first house, you go and you take a ticket for that unit and you hope that it's drawn in each time step. Same for the second, same for the third, and you just wait until your number is called. The second mechanism is called waitlist without choice. And so what you do is you wait in line for all 3 units. If you get to the front, you're offered the unit. Maybe you don't want this unit. Maybe you don't really want an apartment because you'd rather have a home. If you reject this because you think you're pretty close to the front of this line and you might get this one soon, you have to go to the back of this line. So you don't get to stay there. You don't get any choice in the matter. You just go to the back of the line, okay? These are 2 of the most used mechanisms. And it turns out, based on this paper, they analyze them and show that these are actually equivalent. This paper then introduces a bunch of other mechanisms. One is a common lottery. So you just have one lottery for all of the affordable housing in the city. Everybody gets a ticket. When your number is called, you get to pick whichever unit you want. Turns out this is very, very good for matching well, okay? Another one is a waitlist with choice. So here you have a waitlist for each separate unit, but when you get to the front, if you reject the unit, you get to stay at the front. Okay, so this is a little bit wonky. So that's pretty interesting. Another one is what they call the ticket saving lottery. So this is interesting. Each time step, as we go through time, you're given a ticket. They equivalent in the sense that they result in the exact same out in equilibrium. So people behave the same way. Okay. The ticket saving lottery, you get a ticket at each step in time. And whenever you want, you can then use those tickets on any of the lotteries. So there are independent lotteries. You can have multiple tickets per lottery, and you get your tickets at each step in time. And then finally, we have the single entry lottery, which means that you can only enter, there are separate lotteries for each unit, and an agent can only enter one lottery ever. So you can either enter the house or the multifamily home or the apartment, okay? And so what they also show is that the common lottery and the waitlists with choice are equivalent, so they also have the same outcomes. And if it turns out that there are negligible participation costs, so it doesn't really cost agents anything to participate, to join the lotteries for affordable housing. It doesn't cost them much to fill out the forms to try and get into affordable housing, which we know that's not true, it costs a lot. Then all four of these last ones are actually equivalent. They all wind up in the same outcomes. Now, which is best in terms of matching well or targeting those in high need? Well, matching well is going to be these common lottery equivalent ones, okay? This is really good for winding up with exactly the units you want. In terms of targeting high need, it turns out that these former ones are actually better. And furthermore, you want to drive up the participation costs so that people don't want to participate in these, which is pretty interesting, I think. Okay, so I think this is a really interesting paper. And what else I like about these paper is that Nick Arnosti and Peng Xi have actually spent a lot of time working with affordable housing in both Boston and New York. So this is where I really want to praise for working with domain experts. Okay. Okay, so now I want to move on to health insurance. So this is going to be the more technical part. So hold tight if you get lost, and then we'll be through it soon. The situation here is that in the US, health insurance is a mess. We have what's called the Affordable Care Act, and the Affordable Care Act is supposed to leave us with affordable health insurance, theoretically. What the Affordable Care Act exchanges have is they have unregulated entry into these markets in each state, and yet we still see high prices. And this is really counterintuitive. If you've ever heard the common mantra in economics, competition should lead to low prices. So why is unregulated entry into the market leading to high prices? Well, it turns out that in each of the states, most of the market share is really just being held by the top 3 insurers. So this is saying that in all of these states, 94% of the patients are just choosing from the top 3 health insurance providers. And so even if there are more health insurance providers, it's like there aren't. It's like all the power is being held by the top 3, so they can set whatever prices they want. The other common type of health insurance market is where an employer contracts for entry with a couple of health insurance providers. So for example, Columbia chooses a couple of health insurance providers to contract for entry with, and as a result of these negotiations, they get lower prices, but also the patients have fewer choices. And so in terms of utility, lower prices is good for utility. I'd rather pay less for my health insurance, but fewer choices could be worse. I could lose my preferred plan, okay? And so the question here is, what's better in terms of maximizing patient utility? And so this problem here actually also came out of Mechanism Design for Social Good, also one of the first meetings back in 2016, where we heard a talk from a health insurance expert at Harvard Kennedy School who was talking about the Affordable Care Act exchanges and the issues there with unregulated entry and what might help them. And so we wound up going back and forth to try and come up with this problem. And so the question we came up with was, how should we design health insurance markets? And specifically one particular question. So this is the model that we came up with that we, sort of got the blessing of this health insurance expert on. So as we abstract things away, it will become less and less realistic for sure, but apparently this question is still interesting to health insurance experts. So patients have preferences over different, was there a question? No? Okay. Patients have preferences over different health insurance plans. So you should think of it as like Aetna is good at treating cancer patients, and Cigna is good at treating diabetes patients, and Kaiser is good at treating athletes, okay? And so a patient will have some preferences over the different plans. And so a patient will want to maximize her utility given whatever her preferences are and whatever prices the different plans charge, okay? And so she'll look at her utility, which is just her value for the plan minus the price for the plan. And even though she prefers Aetna, she has the highest value for Aetna, because of the prices they charge, she actually prefers Kaiser Permanente. She has the highest utility for Kaiser, okay? But this is just one patient from a population. And so what I mean here is that these values are going to be drawn from a prior distribution, okay? So we're representing a population with some distribution. Each of these values are going to be drawn from the distribution F. Specifically, each individual value will be drawn identically and independently, okay? So imagine, a priori, all of the insurance providers look the same to everyone, but each person winds up having, their own health issues and therefore preferring different plans. The providers are going to strategically price prices. So the way they're going to do this is they're going to think about what the agent preferences might be by reasoning about the prior distribution and what draws might come from it. And also by reasoning about the fact that other providers are going to be strategic in how they plus prices. And so what we want to ask is, if we're reasoning about this free market setting, like the Affordable Care Act, where anyone can enter, or the limited entry setting, where the employer is negotiating these contracts. And in particular, I want to focus on one rule. I want to focus on the rule where we're just not going to allow the most expensive plan to enter, okay? All of these insurers are going to tell me the prices they'd like to set, and I'll say you can all enter and set those prices, except for the most expensive plan, you cannot enter my market, okay? Why not a different number? We analyze that as well, but this is the best one because we'd rather have as many plans as possible, okay? And so between these two, we just want to ask, does it benefit consumers to limit entry? Precisely in equilibrium, which has better utility, okay? Am I going too fast? Am I talking too fast? Okay,
no,
let me know if I am.
Can you describe the rules of the game again? We have this distribution.
Yeah, I think it'll be more clear in a second. Okay.
Considering considering the constraint that the most expensive cannot enter, would it be possible that the providers create a bogus provider setting a very high price just to make sure that this bogus provider doesn't get in and they get in themselves?
That's a great question. We're not focusing on a setting where the providers can collaborate here, but in that setting, you might see something like that as well. But we're just, each provider here is acting independently. And we have a fixed number of providers, yeah. That's a great question though.
I see, so at the beginning, the fixed number of providers, this is totally fixed. And now each one gets to fix a price. And then based on just after that, you kick out the most expensive one. Okay.
Yeah, so they'll each submit a price to me, the government, and I will not allow the most expensive one to enter. The rest will enter, and then the patients will choose which plan they want to buy from them. Okay, so let's consider that limited entry setting where the most expensive provider is not allowed to enter. And so a patient's value for each of the insurers is again drawn, IID, from this distribution F, okay? And so what it turns out, something called Bertrand competition, is that the unique equilibrium in this setting, it kind of feels like a cheat, is that every single provider is going to set a price of 0. Why is that? If Aetna sets a price of $10, Cigna and Kaiser want to make sure that they are in the market. Otherwise, they're not going to get any proceeds, right? If they're not in the market, they're not getting any revenue. So they want to make sure that they're not the most expensive provider. They're going to set $9. So now Aetna is getting kicked out. So Aetna is going to set something less than $9. And so Cigna is going to set something less than that. And so they're going to just race into the bottom to make sure that they are setting the lowest price possible so that they're not getting kicked out. Because otherwise they're not getting anything. They'll always do better by being in the market. Does that make sense? And you can imagine the tie-breaking rule is if they all set the same price, then somebody is randomly kicked out. Okay. So they'll race to the bottom. The only equilibrium there is for all of them to set a price of 0. Some people might be complaining in their head, but they have costs. If they have costs, then they will, race down to costs. So if they all have identical costs, we're dealing with, a priori identical insurers, then same thing, they'll race down to cost, okay? So they'll race down to 0, and then the government will just randomly exclude someone, okay? And so what will the patient do? Who will the patient choose then? The patient will just choose their favorite because all of the prices are 0, so they don't factor into their choice. So the patient will just choose their favorite of the N-1 remaining insurers. So I'm going to use this to denote, a random variable that's just the favorite draw of N-1, okay? And so what is equilibrium utility here? Equilibrium utility is just value minus payment for any agent, which is just the favorite of N-1 drawn from F minus the price 0. So just this favorite of N-1, okay? Okay, so now let's go to the free market and analyze the utility in the free market. Any questions there? Okay, in the free market, again, we want to look at what prices.
Oh, I had a question. So you're not assuming like sealed bids or anything like this, any kind of secrecy?
It is sealed bids, but we're talking about equilibrium. What's going to happen in equilibrium?
I see, but how would you know if? So equilibrium assumes that you know what the other players are doing. Your definition of equilibrium.
Equilibrium assumes that you are reasoning about what the other players are doing.
Oh, I see. Just that you're assuming that. Huh.
So you're assuming that they are responding strategically, that they know that the patients come from this distribution and they're being strategic.
I see. Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. Yeah. Okay. So in the free market, we want to think what prices are these insurers going to set in equilibrium? And we want to think about when is there a unique symmetric equilibrium? All of our providers are symmetric in the sense that our patients are having symmetric values drawn for them. And so we'd also like to think about when is this equilibrium symmetric? Okay, so again, reminder, our values are drawn IID from this distribution F. F is the CDF, so F of Q just means that the probability that a patient values a plan at most Q, okay. So we want to think about what is the revenue that some provider is making by setting some price. So their payoff is just the probability that a patient purchases from them times the price they set. That's their expected revenue, right? We need that probability for it to be their expected revenue. Now, we want to think about what are they doing in equilibrium? So what QI should they set in response to the PIs that everybody else is setting? This is what they're imagining. What should they do in response? What's their best response? Okay, And the key idea that we do is we pretend that the insurer is actually just the only insurer. They're a monopolist. There are no other insurers. Okay, so we're going to come down to this scenario where they're the only insurer. They're the monopolist. And we're going to think about the classic revenue maximization setting where we just have one seller. And in this setting, expected revenue is just the probability that the customer is willing to pay the price times the price, okay? And that's just the inverse CDF, the probability that the customer's value is at least Q times Q, okay? This is just the classic that we know about from all of our Google ad auctions, Spectrum auctions, et cetera. We're very used to these applications. So now what we're gonna do is we're just gonna define a new distribution such that our inverse CDF is exactly the probability that some patient is gonna purchase from Cigna when Cigna charges Q and everybody else is posting P, okay? So we're just gonna redefine this distribution such that the payoff here is exactly, mirroring this, okay? Whatever this distribution is. Does that make sense? I'm not telling you what does this distribution look like. I'm just saying I'm making up a new distribution such that they look the same. Does that make sense? Okay, so what can I do with that? This weird wonky probability, I've defined a new distribution to take care of that. And so what I can do with that, now that I've defined this new population, F star P, that I'm dealing with, well, in the classic setting, we know how to solve this revenue maximization problem. We just set our price, the optimal price, using this theory that we call Meyerson theory. You just take the inverse of this function, okay? When it's 0, it turns out that that's the right price to set. And this function, you don't have to worry about it. It's pretty simple. It only depends on the distribution and the value, okay? And it's unique under the condition called MHR, monotone hazard rate. And all that means is that this here is decreasing, okay? This is a sufficient condition for this to be unique. Again, if that seems like too much, don't worry about it. So what that means is that insurer I's best response, since we're mirroring the classic scenario, is that we're just gonna set the Meyerson price for our new population, okay? We're gonna use this new F star P distribution, and it's gonna be unique exactly when this new distribution is MHR, okay? But what does that mean? Well, it turns out what that means is that when our original population is what we defined the MHR plus, which is just a small restriction of MHR, and decreasing density, then everything works out, okay? And then for it to be symmetric, we just need Q to equal P, okay? And it turns out that these conditions are enough that we can just solve for it and get this equation, which is just the hazard rate of the second max of n draws for people who are familiar with hazard rates. But it turns out it's just a nice characteristic of the distribution, okay? Again, if you don't feel like dealing with hazard rates, you can just sort of ignore the hazard rate things. But the main idea here is we sort of pretend there's a different distribution so that we can reduce it to the main revenue maximization problem and just use that here, even though we're actually dealing with these weird probabilities from all of these insurers. So now, since everybody's setting the same price, our patient's just gonna choose the favorite of n insurers, which means that their value is gonna be the max of n draws, since everything's IID. And so the utility is going to be the max of n draws minus this price here. Okay.
I have a question. Are you assuming every insurance company is symmetric, the behavior?
Yes. Yeah, the draws.
If it's symmetric, then why do patients have like a preference?
Well, so they have draws from a distribution, but the realizations are not the same. So there's going to be a different draw that's max. That's why they have a preference.
But they're gonna post the same price?
Well, so we're looking at the case where the equilibrium is symmetric. So they're posting the same price, but you might have a favorite plan because you prefer a plan that covers athletes.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
So now we have these two conditions, the expected utility in the limited entry setting and the expected utility in the free market. So when is the expected utility in the limited entry setting higher? Well, this looks kind of weird, but it turns out we can rearrange this. This is just the max of n-1 draws. We rewrite the max of n-1 draws from the distribution by thinking about how would we sample the max of n-1. We could sample the max of n-1 by sampling from n and then removing one, okay? And so that's just how we rewrite it as what if we sample from n and then the chance that we remove the max of n versus the chance that we remove the second max of n, okay? So that's all I've done. What if we remove the max of n versus what if we remove the second max of n? Then what I'm going to use is one more fact from revenue maximization, which I think is really cool, which is the fact that the second price auction with a reserve price is optimal when we're dealing with IID bidders, okay? And so here I have the second max of n. So this is going to be the second price. And this is equal to what we call in mechanism design and revenue maximization theory, virtual welfare. And this is that same function before. And when you write out what that function is, it turns out you can write it as the max of n when you're dealing with this minus the hazard rate, the inverse hazard rate in expectation. And so what we can do is we can take our second max of n here and apply Meyerson's lemma using the formula for virtual welfare and replace the second max of n here. And that actually gives us this different condition when we rearrange this in terms of just hazard rates of the max of n and the second max of n. And so what is this weird condition in terms of the hazard rates? Well, it just tells you something basically about the tails of the distribution. Hazard rates have to do with the tails of the distribution. And basically what it's saying is that if the tail is exponential or lighter, then you should limit entry. And so what it's saying is if it's MHR, which is also MHR plus because that's a restriction, then limiting entry is best. And if it's MHR plus, then we know we also have a solution to these equilibria. And so this is lots of typical distributions, exponential, uniform, Gaussian. And what that really means is that your second choice is then really close to your first choice. So it doesn't matter if we kick somebody out from the market, everybody's going to be pretty happy. Okay, so that's the result here. And so it's sort of, in terms of how would you go back and interpret it, you're thinking like, what does the data look like? What are people's values look like in the real world? And then based on that, should I limit entry or not? Okay. So that's how you might use it in practice. Obviously, this is very stylized. We've abstracted a lot of things away. And we would have to go back to our health insurance expert and ask, where do we go next with this? But that's sort of the interpretation. And what I think is really cool is that as a theorist, I get to use my fun revenue maximization tools for a problem that's completely unrelated and has to do with social good. So are there any questions there?
That is a little bit of a side question, but coming from machine learning and more computer vision application, this is something that is quite new to me. What class should I take if I want to go deeper in this, or which resources should I look into?
That's a great question. I'm going to push that until the end, but it's a great question. And if you don't stay until the end for some reason, email me.
All right, thank you.
Okay. There's a long question in the chat, but I can't parse it. So
I can read it if you want. So Ashley Blackier is asking, much of this research is motivated by, I assume, the values of openness and transparency, both from an academic perspective and the good government perspective. You also stated that you're not considering the scenario of insurer collaboration and presumably other stakeholder collaboration. How does this affect the overall approach you take to designing in this environment? Are there any overarching assumptions you're forced to make, say, to undermine capitalist goals and keep these questions relevant?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's a big question in theory is constantly what assumptions do we have to make and how can we relax assumptions? And it's an ongoing question. It's a big question and there's no simple answer. relaxing assumptions about collaboration as a whole direction. And a lot of, stuff I've worked on is trying to relax assumptions, but there's always further to go. And in order for a problem to be tractable and understand the theoretical components, you have to make some assumptions. So it's a constant give and take. But I think that's a conversation we could have for hours, and I would love to. But I'm gonna keep going with the talk because I'm running out of time. But great question, thank you. Okay, cool. So just to say one more thing about health insurance, another thing that I think is interesting is a problem dealing with basically the fact that insurance companies don't want sicker patients, okay? And it's called moral hazard. So what the government does is they reimburse health insurance companies for sicker patients, okay? Especially in markets like Medicaid. So they give them some reimbursement. But if they were to just reimburse them at the end of the year for any, very large costs, then this would, not incentivize the insurance company to keep the costs down. They would send the patient to get any treatment they wanted, all of the different procedures. And so what's done instead is that the government actually says, I'm just going to pay you the expected cost for this patient up front. So this is called risk adjustment. Here's the expected cost. Here's the problem. What is the expected cost based on? So one thing that happens is that insurance companies target poorly estimated patients. They say, I think I know more about this patient than the government does. And so I'm going to try and, take this patient because the government thinks that the expected cost is higher than it is. And so there's a whole question about how should the government try and deal with these poorly estimated patients. There's a really interesting paper by Mark Braverman and Sylvain Chasson. Another thing that happens, however, and I think this is like a huge problem that would be very interesting to investigate, is what's called upcoding. And so what happens here is that insurance companies try and inflate the expected cost. So what they do is they, work with doctors and they send patients to doctors to get the best physical they've ever had, get every diagnosis labeled on them. And now the expected cost goes way up because it goes with diagnoses. And so the insurance company pockets all of the extra expected cost. And so how can we deal with medical data? There's so much we want to do with medical data. We want to machine learn on medical data and solve all of our medical problems. But if diagnoses go up and up in order to, get higher reimbursements from the government, or because doctors want to, label higher diagnoses to get reimbursements from insurance companies, then how can we deal with that medical data? So there is such an incentive to upcode medical data. How can we deal with that? Sure, you can just throw machine learning at it, but that's not going to deal with the fact that there are incentives here. So how do you deal with the incentives here? So this almost is like a strategic classification or regression type problem. So I think this is a really interesting problem here. Okay. This one is a little bit long, so maybe I'll skip it. Right, 55? Okay.
Oh, sure, I think, yeah, that would be. I don't know
okay.
How long is it 2/5 of the talk we've gone through?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay, okay. So another issue is that, manufacturers, when they are, producing goods, they also emit carbon into the atmosphere, which is bad for the planet. But we like what they produce. There's a reason we don't outlaw it altogether. And that's because their steel and cement is good for the economy. And so the government's goal here is to try and trade off the economic value and the societal cost. And so this is exactly what's done with a whole bunch of different organizations called emissions trading schemes. And so what they use is called cap and trade. What they do is they cap the total amount of carbon pollution per year. Maybe they say there's at most 100 metric tons of carbon that can be produced in the next year. And then they require one license to be held for every metric ton of carbon that's polluted, okay? And so the question is, now that we have this limited 100 licenses for the next year, how should they be allocated among all of the manufacturers that want them? So here's the model. Here we have a bunch of manufacturers. The blue manufacturer here wants their first license at $45. That's how much, you know, emitting steel that is valued to them once they sell it. The second license is worth $35. The third license is worth $8, and so on. Here we have the cost to society. So in this toy example, each successive unit of pollution is going to cost society $30. This is unrealistic. It's just for my example. It actually should increase and increase and increase. The more pollution there is, the worse it is for the planet. Okay. And so our goal is to trade these two things off. You might think it odd that I've measured this in dollars. This is a real thing that economists compute and, you know, rely on this value. And so most emissions trading schemes around the world use what's called the uniform price auction. So why do they use this? If we had our manufacturers truly tell us their reports, how much they value the licenses, then this auction would maximize this objective for whatever cap we choose, okay? But as I said at the beginning, we don't always get truthful input. And this auction does not incentivize truthful input. And due to the mixed sign objective here, this can actually result in a negative objective, more harm than good coming out of it. So why are we even using this auction at all? So what is our auction? The government's gonna set some cap. They're gonna say, okay, I'm allocating 3 licenses in the next year. The firms are gonna submit their bids in decreasing order. And then the cap highest bids will win. And the price is going to be the lowest winning bid. So $32 here. And so the objective is just the economic value allocated minus the cost, which is $22 here. What's Blue's utility? Blue's utility here is his value minus the price he pays for each one, which is $16. The thing is, if Blue were to misreport and say he only wants 1 license, then it's gonna lower the price so much that he actually is gonna get higher utility, okay? So even though he's getting fewer licenses now, it's lowering the price so much that it's better for him. And what's more is we're still allocating 3 licenses, so it has the same cost to society, but it's a worse allocation and we're winding up with a negative value. So this is that more harm than good scenario. There's actually 2 more things that happen in reality. There are these 2 modifications. One is a reserve price. You can add a price and say, we're never gonna sell below this price. You might wind up selling fewer than the number of cap licenses. And the other thing is you could say, we have a ceiling, we can always buy extra for $100. The reason these exist is because the demand is uncertain. You have no idea how much the different manufacturers are gonna wanna buy each year. This policy is written into law in advance. And so these are sort of like emergency levers, okay? And so what happens if we set a reserve price of $30, which happens to be the cost right here? Well, the price can never go down to $10. It's always going to stay up at $30, even if people don't want that many. And so then Blue is not incentivized to report this low, and it actually fixes this allocation. So these modifications can really help. And so the question we ask is, how can we fix this allocation of licenses to be robust to the strategic behavior? This auction is not truthful, okay? But maybe we can make it more robust. Maybe we can guarantee an approximation even under the strategic behavior. Okay.
Is there a secondary market where manufacturers resell licenses?
That is an excellent question. There is absolutely a secondary market. It does not work very well right now. In the problem I'm looking at, I'm ignoring the secondary market because it does not work very well, but that is a super important question for future work. But it's a great question. And I can talk loads more about why it's not working well right now. Okay, so basically I'm not gonna go to the European Union and say, use a different mechanism, use VCG, it'll fix everything. It would fix everything, by the way. They don't wanna use VCG, they wanna use the uniform price auction. The entire world is using the uniform price auction, but maybe I can say, tune your parameters, it'll give better guarantees against strategic behavior. So more precisely, there's going to be N manufacturers. Each of them is going to have some concave value curves, so decreasing value for each successive license. It's going to be drawn from some personal distribution. You know, as the government, I know the priors, but I don't know what their values will actually be. So I have some, previous data, so I can guess what their values will be, but I don't actually know. This cost of carbon, the societal cost, is known. It's convex. The world explodes the more pollution there is, and it's fixed. Okay. So what we show is that we can get a constant factor approximation to what you would do if you had this best cap, this best reserve price, this best ceiling. You tuned the parameters in the best way for our expected objective under true reports, which we know we're not getting. They're not being truthful, with strategic behavior, and we set a particular cap and reserve price. And so what we're doing is we're setting a reserve price in order to get back this never more harm than good thing. Essentially, this is a price of anarchy result. And then we set a cap in order to get back our approximation. So first the reserve price gets back the never more harm than good, and then the cap that gets back their approximation. 2-second look at the proof. Basically, we carve up the probability space and you do like a nice little approximation of what would happen in all the different areas, but not going into it at all. Okay, I was going to say 2 words about basically, I'm skipping now, Eric. I'm assuming I'm skipping, yes?
Yeah, I think you're doing fine.
Should I skip to the end?
Yeah, I guess so. So we have time for
questions.
And stuff.
Okay. So I was going to say basically 2 words about this model by Lily Hu and Yiling Chen, where they look at achieving statistical parity in dynamic hiring. And basically the result is just that you can't hire group blind and achieve statistical parity. I think it's an interesting model about hiring in the labor market. And there's a very similar result about admissions being group blind. So these are cool papers, happy to point you to them, point you to the authors or talk more about them. And I think there's some interesting work in education as well about course allocation, parental engagement. You want parents to be engaged in their children's education. It winds up with better outcomes for the kids. As well as, I think there's all sorts of questions about funding education. Lots of people believe in school vouchers. Right now schools are funded based on test scores. I have not seen very much work on this in the community, so I would love to see more work on this. So I think there's loads more topics. Finally, I just want to advertise a brand new Acm Conference, email, equity and access and algorithms, mechanisms and optimization. The submissions deadline is soon. This is a highly interdisciplinary conference. There's both a research track and a policy and practice track. Should be really good. So where should you go if you want to learn more about this? One place to go is Mechanism Design for Social Good, the initiative, as well as the attached conference email. So this is a very, very broad initiative. It's not exclusively theory focused. There's all sorts of working groups and resources on the website. There's lots of nonprofit partnerships and domain experts. So that's a great place to go to learn. If you want to look at exclusively theory focused stuff, I would recommend attending FORP, which is coming up June 9th through 11th. Make sure you register by June 7th. So this is a new conference that is really focused on theory. I would recommend talking to domain experts within your university. And also I'll be starting a Boston area seminar series and workshop series focused both on mechanism design and social good broadly within theory. So please email me if you're interested. I'd be happy to get you on the email list. And yeah, if I didn't cover anything in terms of resources, let me know. I'd be happy to send you resources. So thank you.
Thanks, Kira. So we'll open it up for questions. And yeah, then I can stop the recording and we can just continue hanging out.
Hi, Kira, I have a question.
Yes.
So I was wondering, so how do you know, like, how do you judge whether mechanism, adding strategic agents to a problem would benefit the problem? Like, for example, strategic classification. Classification in itself is a hard problem, and like fairness in classification is a hard problem. And then whether we should consider agents to be strategic in this setting or not. how do we decide?
Well, I guess there's two parts. One is, I think, is this realistic? Do we encounter these scenarios? And is this something we should study because we encounter it in the real world? And then there's also the question of, do you think that would make an interesting problem? Do you think it would wind up with interesting outcomes? And that's sort of the latter is sort of a different question, because I guess that takes more of a feel for why would it create a different outcome. And I think I would have to think harder about that answer for different scenarios.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question about just in general, the assumption, or kind of the way that these problems work is that both the algorithm, say in your health insurance example, the algorithm of the consumer, right? And the algorithm of the provider. I was just wondering if you relaxed either one of those, if you didn't know, say, the algorithm of the provider, or it up to some, basically it's more aligned to the question about, okay, if they get to, the reason why they can't collaborate was because if you had another provider and there was the result of a collaboration, then this other provider wouldn't be following the algorithm that you specified.
Okay, so I wouldn't say I know the algorithm. That's not how I would phrase it. I know the objective of each individual, and that is the assumption of game theory. I know every individual's objective. And then how will they interact with the whole setting has to do with what is the setting. And that's really the fundamental question of any game theory or mechanism design question. I know every individual's objective always, but what situation do I put them in and how do they interact with the setting? Well, now I have their objective, now they're interacting with the setting, right? Like, I know what they're optimizing for, but now I'm showing them the different actions that they could take. So now they're optimizing in my setting over these actions. And so I could ask the collaboration question for sure. It's just a different question. I could ask, how are they going to operate together? Absolutely. Now they're just optimizing over different actions. I didn't allow those actions. I didn't allow the collaboration actions before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, I guess I was asking, let's say if you had some people that, I don't know, with some chance, they actually don't care who their provider is, like then, and they just pick whichever one. Or yeah, you change the algorithm in either way. So all these results, they're kind of they're specific. It's like, how
Absolutely.
both things interact. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. And so actually in the healthcare model, let me go back to it. So really what I was solving for here, I was actually solving for essentially what is the algorithm that the providers are doing. I know their objective, but now I'm solving for what exactly are they going to do given the setting I put them in, because they're doing two different things in the two different settings. They have the same objective in both, but I'm sort of putting them in two different settings and seeing how they behave in the two different settings. Right? So here they're setting this price. They're setting this very specific price. And I was analyzing, why are they setting that price? Even though in both, they're just trying to optimize their payoff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's.
But yeah, it's a great question in terms of what would happen if I was dealing with patients who just picked a health insurance plan randomly or didn't fully understand their preferences, and you could ask all sorts of things. I think that introducing behavioral game theory or other types of assumptions into these problems is super interesting. I've worked a little bit with risk aversion or interdependent models or other types of behavioral models, and I think it is super, super interesting and really important. Yeah, especially in health insurance.
Questions in the chat. I guess the first question is, the model assuming 100% rational agent or a real world human? I guess that's the question you just addressed.
Yeah, so okay. So most of them that I discussed, yes, but the thing is, in terms of just picking a price, that is the simplest mechanism and avoids most behavioral biases. So here, yes, I'm assuming they have preferences in the health insurance model, but it's one of the simplest assumptions in terms of human behavior. So like it doesn't suffer from any risk aversion or whatever, but it does assume that people know their preferences, which in terms of health insurance, people obviously often don't even know what's going on with health insurance plans. So that's a real thing to pursue. Sure, okay. And then there's a question in terms of which classes to take. I'm not sure that classes really exist yet in terms of this. There are a couple of, I think like Jason Hartline is teaching a mechanism design plus X class at Northwestern. I think that John Dickerson taught an applied mechanism design and social good class at UMD, but I'm not sure it really went into theory. Hopefully I'll teach a class on this sometime in the next year or two. There are some notes on my website under resources from the initial reading group, which I can try and clean up, but I'm not sure how many classes exist so far, hopefully soon.
Yeah, in the carbon emission problem, you mentioned that the companies are not willing to disclose their economic value, right? That was one of the issues. Then what about using secure multi-party computation, where people are actually telling their thing, but they can collectively compute as to what is the collective function without really no party disclosing their true value to the other parties?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in some settings that makes a lot of sense. So for example, there's this setting called, here, let me go back to that slide. So there's one setting called the interdependent value setting, where essentially, you know, each of us is looking at buying a house, and I know about the foundation of the house, and you know how good the roof is, and Eric knows how good the pipes are, and we all want to know about that information in order to know what our value for the house is. And I think that's a great setting for secure multi-party computation, because we all want to know those things, but we're afraid to tell each other. In this case, what's happening is not that they're just afraid to reveal their information for privacy concerns, but they can actually do better by lying about their information, right? So you're actually improving your outcomes by lying. So it's not just like a privacy concern, but you actually want to, you know, distort the outcome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but great question.
Okay, well, I'll stop the recording now.